Hello, I'm Dr. David Adams. In this session, we'll be reading an oracle from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 45, verses 1 to 7. In this passage, God speaks to the Persian king Cyrus, whom he's chosen to be an agent to deliver his people from their bondage in Babylon. So, grab your copy of the Tanakh and let's get started. At the end of Isaiah 44, God states his intention to use Cyrus to accomplish his will to rebuild Jerusalem and establish the temple once again. In the oracle that begins chapter 45, he speaks a message to this same Cyrus. So before we go any further, we probably need to know who this Cyrus is and what role he plays in God's plan to restore his people. This Cyrus is Cyrus II, the ruler of Persia, commonly called Cyrus the Great. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about 100 years after the death of Cyrus, gives us an extensive account of his life in Book 1 of his histories. But much of what Herodotus writes is mythical or legendary in nature, and its reliability is pretty dubious, though it's often repeated as fact even today. For our purposes, what matters is that Cyrus was born around 600 BC in the kingdom of Anshan. Now, if you think about the Middle East, the Zagros Mountains separate Mesopotamia to their west from the Asian kingdoms to their east. By the late 8th century BC, the ancient kingdom of Elam was in decline, and to its northwest, the kingdom of the Medes was on the rise. To the southeast of Elam, the Persian kingdom was increasing in power and influence. And Anshan was a small city-state kingdom on the border of Elam and Persia, ruled by a king, the father of Cyrus, who was probably Persian in origin. The mother of Cyrus was the daughter of the king of the Medes. We'll ignore most of the legendary tales that Herodotus recounts about the childhood of Cyrus. We do know that Cyrus became king of Anshan when his father died around 559. In the years that followed, Cyrus extended his rule by defeating his grandfather, his mother's father, in battle, and subjugating Elam around 550, resulting in a united Medo-Persian kingdom under his rule. From there, he set out to extend his rule further, eventually subjugating virtually all of the Middle East, from modern Turkey in the west, south to the border of Egypt, east almost to the border of India, creating what has come to be known as the Achaemenid Empire, or typically called the Persian Empire, that lasted beyond the end of the Old Testament, down to the conquest of Alexander the Great around 330. In the process, he defeated Babylon in 539. Now, Cyrus himself died in 530, probably in battle, and was buried in the Persian capital in a coffin of gold, placed in a simple but richly decorated tomb. That tomb was plundered after the conquest of Alexander, but the structure remains to this day. For our purposes, what matters is the conquest of Babylon in 539. Unlike his predecessors, Cyrus believed that the key to political stability was to treat subjugated peoples well. In pursuit of that policy, Cyrus allowed the peoples that Babylon had conquered to return to their ancient homelands and rebuild their cities and temples. While the Cyrus cylinder that records these deeds does not mention Judah, both the Bible and extra-biblical historical materials make it clear that it was Cyrus who allowed the repatriation of the Judahites, bringing about the end of the exile in the years after 539. In our passage, God speaks a message to Cyrus through the prophet Isaiah. The oracle begins with a common formulaic opening. Ko'amar Yahweh Lemishiko Lechoresh. Thus says Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus. The form Limshiko is the noun Mashiach, one who is anointed, with a lamed preposition and a third person masculine singular possessive suffix. This is, of course, the word from which we get our term Messiah. But it would probably be a mistake to translate the word that way here. The Hebrew Mashiach refers to a person who's chosen for a particular task and certified to perform that task by having been anointed with oil, a sign of being inducted into an office. Here, the word is followed by an appositive, Lechoresh, to Cyrus, identifying who the anointed is in this case. The rest of the verse tells us what it is that this chosen and anointed servant is to do. Asher hechizakti bimino. This relative clause begins with a reassertion of God's approval. The hechizakti is a Hiphial perfect from the root cheth zayin kof, chazak. In the call, this verb means to be strong or be confident. This is one of the verbs used to talk about the hardening of the heart of Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. In the Hiphial, this verb is transitive, most commonly communicating the idea of strengthening something or giving someone confidence. But notice, here it's followed by the preposition beith to mark the object of the verb. When used in this way, the verb has the sense of taking hold of something, in this case, the right hand of Cyrus. Often this idiom is used in the literal sense of grasping something or holding on to it. But here it's a metaphor for strengthening or empowerment. To take hold of the hand is to lend someone strength or support them. So we might read this as, whom I have taken by the hand, or perhaps somewhat more loosely, whom I have strengthened. What God is empowering Cyrus to do is made clear by what follows. Lorad lepanau goyim. The form lorad is a bit curious. There's a general agreement that we should read this as an infinitive construct of the geminate root, resh dalet daleth, radad, to beat down or subjugate or subdue. But it's pointed in a non-standard way. We would expect the form to be larod, and that's noted in the textual apparatus. So God is strengthening the hand of Cyrus so that he can subjugate before him the nations, which is, of course, exactly what Cyrus proceeds to do. But the description of what God intends for Cyrus continues. Umathane malakim afaseach liftoach lefanau delathayim. The first word in this phrase is the construct of the word mathanaim, a word that always occurs in a dual formation and is traditionally translated loins. But loins is a word that most modern English speakers only use to refer to a cut of meat. So what is this word actually used for? Well, it generally refers to that part of the body that joins the upper body to the lower body. A modern gloss might be something like the waist, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Sometimes mathanaim is a euphemism for sexual organs, especially those of males. In other places, it seems to have been used to give the connotation of strength, perhaps associated with the thighs or the big muscles of the upper legs. So here we have the construct phrase, the loins of kings. The verb that follows is afateach. This is a piel form from the root pei tau, cheth, patach, the verbal root from which we get the name of the vowel pathak. In the call, this verb means to open or open up. But in the PL, it commonly has a sense of to let something go or release something or even set something free. Several times it's used in the sense to untie or to loosen something. So, translated in a primitive way, this phrase would be something like, I will untie or loosen the waists of kings. But that's not very clear. So let's finish the clause and then see what sense we can make of it. The rest of the clause indicates the reason for the action. Liftoach lefanao de lafayim. Here again we have the verb pathak, this time as a call infinitive construct. To open for him the delathayim, the doors. This noun, here in a dual formation, is the source of our letter name, Daleth. In case you're wondering what doors we're talking about, the last phrase clarifies that. U'sha'araim lo yeshageru. I would take the wow that begins the phrase as resultative, in line with the preceding lamed preposition, so that the gates will not be closed. The verb is a nifal from the root samek gimel resh, sagar, to close or shut. So that at least clarifies what's meant by the word doors. In this context, doors is a reference to the city gates, which is dual because city gates normally occur in pairs. Here's a picture of the reconstructed city gates from the Assyrian city that was near the modern Iraqi town of Balawat. This at least gives us an idea of what the speaker is talking about when he speaks of doors and gates. But we're still left with the problem of how to understand the whole phrase. A primitive rendering might be something like, and the waists of kings I will loosen, to open for him the doors so that the gates will not be closed. What in the world is meant by that? Well, this is one of those cases where everybody knows what the words mean, but the meaning of the whole is elusive, and translators disagree on how to understand it. So let's look at how it's handled by various translations. As you might expect, the New American Standard retains the most primitive reading. And to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. Now that's accurate, but it's not particularly helpful. Similarly, the ESV renders this, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. That follows the text clearly enough, except that they take the word waist, or loins, if you will, to refer to the belts that go around the waist. That's certainly defensible as an example of metonymy, but I doubt that many modern readers could explain what's meant by it. Other translations offer more interpretive translations. For example, the NIV has, and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. Here the translators are interpreting the phrase, to loosen the waist of kings, to refer to unbuckling the straps that hold the armor in place. The point being that Cyrus will disarm other kings so that their cities will surrender, opening their gates to him. This is certainly a plausible interpretation and one that's fairly commonly accepted. The NET Bible does something similar. It renders this, and disarm king, to open doors before him so that gates remain unclosed. This is the same idea as the NIV, though it's said in fewer words. The New Jerusalem Bible essentially does the same thing, and to disarm king, to open gateways before him so that their gates be closed no more. And while that's the most common interpretation, it's by no means the only possibility. The ancient translations also struggle with this. The Septuagint renders it, "and the power of kings I will shatter." And Jerome is even further afield with, "and the back of kings I will turn," apparently implying that they will run away and retreat before the armies of Cyrus. Now, this appears to connect to an idea that's offered by the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, which suggests that the sense here is that the garments around the waist are going to be loosened in order to allow kings to run freely and open the gates of their cities. Well, if the exact sense of this idiom is not certain, the main point is clear enough. Yahweh will strengthen Cyrus so that the kings and their cities will open their gates to surrender to him. And by the way, this is actually what happened at Babylon in 539, when the city opened its gates and surrendered to the army of Cyrus without a fight. Verse 2 continues the theme of the first verse, emphasizing that Cyrus's victories will be Yahweh's doing. Ani lefanecha elek. The verb is a call in perfect first person, since it is God who's speaking here, and it's from the common verb halak, meaning to go. The first person subject is reinforced by a fronted pronoun. Now, there are kind of three ways of handling this pronoun. You could regard it as emphatic and translate it something like, "I myself will go before you." Alternately, you could take it as highlighting the change of subject, the immediate subject at the end of the last verse being the city gates. In that case, you might render it something like, "As for me, I will go." Or you could simply regard it as redundant and translate, "I will go before you." The main emphasis in the verse is what God's presence with Cyrus will bring about. And that's the point of the rest of the verse. Hadurim washer. Here again, the context suggests that we should take the wow as resultative. So that. If the verb uasher strikes you as problematic, you're right. It is a bit of a problem. So let's spend a moment to understand what we have here. This is a kethiv kare form, a form that the Masoretes believe has been incorrectly copied. So they place the vowels of the word that they think you should read with the consonants that are actually in the text before them. The kethiv, the form that's written, appears to be a hifil from yashar, "I will make smooth." But the hifil of this verb is really rare, only occurring twice in the whole Tanakh. So the Masoretes think that it should be repointed as a piel from the same root, and with a very similar meaning. Hence the kare form, that is, the form to be read. So what we have in the text is the form with the consonants of the hifil and the vowels of the piel, indicating that the Masoretes want us to read it as a piel. Either way, we end up with a word that means something like, "I will level off," or perhaps, "I will make straight," or "make smooth." But the hard part of this phrase is the noun that's the object of this verb, hadurim. This is an unknown word that does not occur elsewhere in biblical Hebrew. Both of the Isaiah scrolls from Cave 1 of the Dead Sea Scrolls read this as mountains, as does the Septuagint. This assumes that the daleth in the text was mistaken for a resh. The word for mountain is normally spelled hair with one resh, but there are three places in the Tanakh where it's spelled with two reshes, as it would be here. And the idea of making mountains level or smooth is a pretty common eschatological theme in the prophets. The problem is that everything else in the immediate context is talking about cities and their conquest. So mountains doesn't make much sense in the context, not to mention the fact that it doesn't explain the presence of the shurek vowel in the text. Another suggestion is that we take this as a call passive participle from the root hey daleth resh, hadar, a fairly obscure word meaning to honor. If so, the honored ones would probably refer to the leading citizens of the city. But again, we run into the problem that the context is talking about places and things, not people. So it's not impossible, but it's also not obviously correct. There is another little-known possibility. It has been suggested that this is the Hebrew form of the Akkadian word duru, meaning city wall. And while we can't be certain that it's correct, this suggestion at least most closely fits the context. So I think that I would read this: I myself will go before you and flatten the city walls. And this flows nicely into the next phrase, Dalthoth nechosha ushaver. Doors of bronze I will shatter. The phrase doors of bronze needs a little clarification. Remember those city gates from Balawat that we saw earlier? These gates, or doors if you prefer, are made of cedar with bronze bands to strengthen them. In this picture, you can see the bronze bands clearly. And here's a shot of the decoration on the bronze bands of the gate, showing Assyrian military scenes. The point is this: they did not make entire city gates out of bronze. If they had, the gates would not only have been immensely heavy, they would have been outrageously expensive, since the tin necessary to make bronze was a rare and valuable commodity in the ancient world. So when the text speaks of bronze doors, it has in mind something like this: doors reinforced with bronze bands. That also helps us to understand the next phrase, Uv riche barzel agadea. The noun buriach refers to a rod or bar, in this case made of barzel or iron. This must refer to some kind of iron bar used to reinforce or strengthen the gates. The verb is appeal, from the root gimel daleth ayin, gada, which means to cut down or perhaps tear down into piel. So I would read this whole verse as, I myself will go before you and flatten the city walls. I will shatter the doors reinforced with bronze and tear down their iron bars. God's opening statement to Cyrus continues in verse 3 and ends with God giving the reason that he intends to do all of this through Cyrus. وَنَثَتِي لَكَ Otzroth Choshek. I have given to you Otzroth Choshek. Choshek is, of course, the very common word for darkness, but Otzroth is more of a challenge. Otzar occurs about 80 times in the Tanakh, so it's a pretty common word, but most students wouldn't know it. In part, this is because of where the word is used. If we use Logos Bible software to look at the distribution of this word, we would see that it occurs most often in 1st and 2nd Kings, in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and with some frequency in Nehemiah and Proverbs. Now, these are books that most students and even most pastors do not read in Hebrew very much. The only commonly read books where this word occurs with any frequency are in Jeremiah and Isaiah. But those are very large books. And if we change this chart to show the frequency of occurrence per 1,000 words, then we'll see that Isaiah and Jeremiah use this word about 1/2 time out of every 1,000 words, or once every 2,000 words. So unless you read a lot of these books, this is a word that you're just not all that likely to have encountered. By the way, there's another oddity about this word that you might notice. This word is treated grammatically as if it were masculine, but the plural of the word is always formed as a feminine noun. This does not affect the meaning, of course, but it just goes to show that in the real world of biblical texts, no language is as simple as beginning grammars make it out to be. But the bigger problem is one of sense. What's meant by the phrase treasures of darkness? Well, perhaps if we read just a bit further, the meaning will become clear. The next phrase is matmune mistarim. The noun matmon basically refers to things that are stored up. Well, what kind of things do you store? Food, for one thing. So this word can refer to provisions or stored up food. But of course, people mostly store up treasure. So here the word is used as a synonym for the earlier otzroth. This word is used in an adjectival construct chain with mistarim, a noun that refers to a secret place or a hiding place. So this phrase refers to things that are hidden away in a secret place. So this second phrase effectively means something like hidden treasure. And that helps us understand what's meant by treasures of darkness. The treasures of darkness are the things that we hide away in a dark, secret place. The next clause is introduced by the ma'an. They're used as a conjunction to introduce a purpose clause, in order that, or so that, you may know. This is followed by an identification clause. With identification clauses, we always have to supply a form of the verb to be. But the question is often where to insert it. We could insert it here, but if we do, then we'll end up taking this last phrase, the God of Israel, as an appositive and read, I am Yahweh who calls you by name, the God of Israel. Another way to handle this is to insert the form of the verb to be before the last phrase. In that case, we would take Yahweh who calls you by name as an appositive and read, I, Yahweh who calls you by name, am the God of Israel. Or you could handle this a bit more loosely and break it into two sentences repeating the initial pronoun. Something like, I am Yahweh who calls you by name. I am the God of Israel. Personally, I think I like the second option the best because the next verse begins by emphasizing what Yahweh is doing for Israel. But you can make your own choice. In verse 3, Yahweh identified himself to Cyrus as the God of Israel. At the beginning of verse 4, the significance of that identification becomes clear. Lama'an adi Yaakov Yisrael bechiri. We just had this word lama'an in the previous verse. There it functioned as a conjunction to join this clause to the previous verse. And since it introduces a purpose clause, we read it as so that, or in order that. Here in verse 4, it does not introduce a clause. It simply forms a phrase with the noun that follows it. So it's not a conjunction here, but a preposition. And as a preposition, lama'an normally means something like for the sake of, or on account of. So we would read this as, for the sake of my servant Jacob. The rest of this clause further defines what's meant by my servant Jacob. And Israel, my Bahir. Notice the pointing pattern here. This is an adjectival type formation from the common verb bachar, meaning to choose. So, and Israel, my chosen one. The point here is important. God is telling Cyrus that the God of Israel chose him not to make him great for his own sake, but for the sake of, we might say, for the benefit of his servant Israel. It is for the sake of Israel that wa ekra laka b'shemecha, I have called you by name. And moreover, akanka walo yadathani. The verb kaf nun he, kana, is a rare word that's probably related to the more common hollow verb kun, meaning to establish. We sometimes call words related in this way biforms. This word suggests the idea of establishing someone in a position of honor or authority by giving them a title or a name. I would take the following wow as concessive and read, I name you even though you had not known me. The point is that God chose Cyrus as his instrument, even though Cyrus was not a worshiper of the God of Israel. Not for the sake of Cyrus or to honor Cyrus, but solely for the sake of Israel. Well, putting this verse together, we would read, for the sake of my servant Jacob, that is Israel, my chosen one, I have called you by name. I gave you a name even though you had not known me. In verse 5, God takes the idea that he called Cyrus for the sake of Israel further. The fact that he is able to do so shows that Yahweh alone is God. Ani Yahweh wa'ain od. I am Yahweh, and there is not oath. The word oath is most often used as an adverb in biblical Hebrew to modify the sense of a verb. It often has the idea of continuing or repeating an action, so it's often translated to do something again or further or more, or sometimes even continually. But it's also used to express the idea of something that's added on. And in that case, it's often translated another. And that's what we have here. Yahweh declares that he is God, and there is not anyone else to be added to that category. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Zulathi ein Elohim. The preposition zulath here, with the first person suffix, expresses the idea of an exception. So we might read this as apart from, or besides, or except for. Here it would mean, besides me, there is no God. The last clause picks up the idea that occurs at the end of the previous verse once again. Va'azerka walo yadathani. The verb aleph zayin resh, azar, is used for putting on a belt, generally a sword belt. In that context, it might be translated something like gird. In a more figurative way, then, it means to prepare or to get ready or to equip for some kind of activity, typically for battle. So God says to Cyrus, I prepare you even though you have not known me. So putting this verse together, we would read, I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God, and I, here really in the sense of I alone, prepare you, even though you have not known me. In verse 6, The theme that God intends his actions to be revelatory continues. Lama'an yedu'u mimizrach shemesh wa mima'arava. So far, we've seen the word lama'an used in two ways, as a conjunction to introduce a purpose clause and as a preposition. So we have to consider how it's being used here. Given that it precedes a finite verb, in this case yeduhu, it's pretty clearly being used as a conjunction. So, in order that they may know, but who are the they that are the subject of the verb? This is tricky. The subject is not signaled by a noun or even a combination of nouns, but by a compound prepositional phrase that creates what is, in effect, an implied relative clause. Let's begin by rendering this in a primitive way. From the mizrach of the sun. The Hebrew mizrach is a noun related to the verbal root zayin resh chet, zarak, that means to arise or appear. So the noun refers to the rising or the appearance of something, and it's most often used in conjunction with the sun, as it is here. In addition, this word is also sometimes used for the direction in which the sun rises. So sometimes it's read with the meaning east. So we read, from the rising of the sun to its ma'urava. This noun is related to the common verbal root, ayin resh base, arav, meaning to cross over or pass by. This is, in fact, the only known occurrence of this word in the Tanakh, or even in early extra-biblical Hebrew. But its meaning is clear enough. It must refer to the crossing over or the passing in of the sun, or as we would say in English, its setting. So we would render this phrase primitively as from the rising of the sun to its setting, or perhaps more freely as from east to west. So as we said, this is a compound prepositional phrase. But what is it doing here? What's happening from east to west? Well, we said this was tricky, and this is the tricky part. The answer is that it is the knowing that will happen from east to west. This is referring to those who will know. So while this phrase is technically adverbial in the sense that it modifies or specifies the action of the verb by telling us where it will happen, they will know from east to west, it may be that the easiest way to handle this in English is to take it as an implied relative clause, functioning as a substantive, in this case as the subject of the verb. And if we did that, we would render this clause something like, in order that all of those from the rising of the sun to its setting will know. The next clause contains another interesting word usage. Ki ephes belavai ani Yahweh wa'ein oath. In this case, the key introduces the subject of the knowing. It tells us what they will know. What they will know is ephes belavai. It's this word ephes that I find interesting here. In the Tanakh, this word ephes usually refers to the edge or the end of something, like the hem of a garment or the shore of the sea or the border of the land. Sometimes you encounter it in the phrase afsei aretz, the ends of the earth. But in modern Hebrew, this is the word for the number 0. It also regularly is used for the idea of nothing, or sometimes even as none or no. The reason that it's used that way in modern Hebrew is that besides being used in the Bible as a noun for end or edge, it's also occasionally used in the sense of nothing. It's even a few times used a bit like the particle ain that occurs in the next phrase here. That's what grammarians might call a particle of negation, meaning there is not. So this phrase, ki ephis beladai, means they will know that there is no one, ephis, besides me. The last phrase in verse 6 is exactly the same as the opening phrase of verse 5. Ani Yahweh wa'ein od. I am Yahweh and there is no other. Meaning, of course, that there's no other God. The use of this phrase at the beginning of verse 5 and then at the end of verse 6 is an example of a rhetorical feature that we call bracketing. Bracketing is a literary device that serves to highlight or emphasize a point that's being made in the material that's surrounded by the brackets. The last verse in our reading ends the statement by God, who underscores his uniqueness by declaring that it is he and no other God who does the things that the other gods can only claim to do. Yotzei or borei choshek. The verbs in this clause are both call participles of verbs that communicate the idea of making something. The first is from the verb yotzade resh, yatzar. This verb generally has the idea of molding or forming something by shaping it. The participle of this verb is used substantively as a noun, meaning potter. But we have to be careful of pushing the imagery too far. In some cases, the image of a potter just doesn't work very well, as in this case. We wouldn't think of forming light as something that a potter does. So sometimes this word simply refers to the more general idea of a maker, without the strong pottery image. But the association of pottery making with creation is a common one in the biblical world, so much so that one of the chief creator gods in Egyptian mythology is the ram-headed god Khnum, who's often depicted as a potter and is responsible for forming human bodies out of the clay, as in this image from the temple at Dendera in Egypt. This may be a little difficult to see, so let me highlight the figure of Khnum and his handiwork. Here's a similar painted image that's easier to see. The connection between pottery making and creation is probably due to the fact that pottery was one of the earliest, the few, and the most common manufactured item in the biblical world. The next phrase uses the verb bara, which is more directly connected to God's creative activity in the Bible. It's sometimes said, mistakenly, I think, that this word means explicitly to create out of nothing. If you look at all the occurrences of this verb, that is clearly not the case. But what is distinctive about this word is that in the Bible, this word is reserved exclusively to talk about God's activity. It never has another subject other than God. But in this case, bara and yatsa are kind of used as synonyms, along with asa in the next clause, for the general idea of making something. So here, Yahweh is described as the God who makes light and darkness. The next phrase highlights another aspect of God's work. Oseh shalom wa borei ra. Here again, we have two call participles used to describe God's activity, asa and bara again. What God makes here are shalom and ra. Shalom, often usually translated peace, gives us no real difficulty, but ra is a different matter altogether. This word is often used for what we might think of as moral evil, but that is not the point here. Here, Ra is used as the opposite of shalom. It's the opposite of welfare or wholeness. So a better translation in this context would be something like harm or hurt or injury. The harm that God brings about is from his judgment or the execution of his justice, not as a result of any moral failing on God's part. So here, shalom and Ra are used as what we might describe as salvation and judgment terms. The verse and our reading for today ends with another identification clause that summarizes the point. Ani Yahweh oseh kol ele. I am Yahweh who does all these things. So how shall we characterize God's message to Cyrus through the prophet Isaiah? He begins by declaring his choice of Cyrus as his anointed instrument, to whom he will give victory and success. And he ends by highlighting the fact that it is he, Yahweh, the only God, who does this. Those are both important elements of our text. But what stands out for me is the reason that God gives for doing this. He does all of these things, Lama'an Abdi Yaakov wa Yisrael Bachiri, as he says in verse 4. He does them for the sake of my servant Jacob, namely my chosen one, Israel. God acts for Israel, and he acts for Israel because he is at work through Israel to accomplish his plan to redeem all creation through Israel's Messiah, Jesus, the ultimate anointed one. And because he's acting for Israel to redeem all creation through Israel's Messiah, he is acting also for you. And it's the recognition that it is you and I and all those who receive Christ who are the ultimate beneficiaries of God's choice of Cyrus that makes this text a witness to the gospel and gives us hope and joy. I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me as we've read through this portion of Isaiah 45 in the original Hebrew text. And I hope you'll join me again soon for another opportunity to study God's Word together in the language in which he inspired it to be written. Until then, shalom in Jesus.